Ach, Yuyan Sham. Yuyan Sham, you should look there. We just mentioned the Bach. Let me take you back. The Bach said that because the Tur who came before him, he says you should get up and you should walk and cover your head. What does he understand from that? What does that mean?
When you sit down, you don't have to.
When you sit down, you don't have to cover your hair. But when you walk,
You have to.
you must cover your head. Now, by the way, this is the complete opposite of what I was thinking. It says that you should get up and you should walk and then you should cover your head. I would understand from there that what does that mean?
That you don't have to cover your head when you walk.
Right, you don't have to cover your head when you walk. Rather, there's somewhere after you walk too that you have to cover your hair. But the Bach seems to understand it differently. Let's give it to the Bach. So I continue here. Ach Yuyan Sham, but you should look over there. Shehabach, this is the beginning of the second paragraph. Shehabach, Katav, he wrote, Lehakshot al divrei hatur. He asked a question on the Tur. Shehishmit, as to why he left out et halashon, the language of shel arba amot, that you're not allowed to walk 4 amot. He doesn't mention anything about 4 amot. Why doesn't the Torah is quoting from the Talmud, so why doesn't he quote the Talmud, which says you should not walk arba amot?
Yeah. With an uncovered head.
Right, bisu halicha b'koma skufa, when coming to walk with an upright back, meaning you're not allowed to walk with an arrogant posture, even for 4 amot. That's what the Talmud says. So why does the Torah neglect to mention this whole idea of 4 amot? Lo kmo shekatvu harif veharosh. Not like the rif and the rosh. They both use the language of 4 amot. Suddenly the Torah comes along and says, we don't need this language of 4 amot. Why? V'katav b'stam, and it says rather the Torah just wrote stam. What does stam mean? She'asur, that you're not allowed to walk without a kippah. I mean, he should have mentioned something about 4 amot. So why did he just mention you're not allowed to walk without a kippah, and he doesn't mention anything about 4 amot? Aval bisu halicha begilui rosh. But when it comes to the prohibition of walking with your head uncovered, lo hishmit, he didn't leave them out, meaning he uses the words 4 amot. So, by walking with an arrogant posture, does the Torah say you're not allowed to walk 4 amot with an arrogant posture?
Yeah.
No. By walking with an arrogant posture, he doesn't say, just you can't walk with an arrogant posture.
Right.
But when it comes to not walking with a kippah on, what does he say? 4 amot. So this is, what's the difference? Why mention 4 amot at the end, but not mention 4 amot in the beginning? Yeah, we understand his question? Let's see what he answers. V'katav sham letaretz, and he wrote there an answer. Shehatur itkaven lahorot, the Tur had an intention to teach. She'isur halicha b'koma skufa, that the prohibition of walking with an arrogant posture, hu isur gamur, is an absolute prohibition. It has no minimum. It's not that you could walk 4 amot with an arrogant posture and then you have to stop. V'chen, and also ra'ui lachmir, and therefore a person should be strict. Lachmir is from the word chumra. Yeah, chumra, stringency. Machmir, a person who does stringency. Afilu bepachot me'arba amot mipnei hatam shel melo kol haaretz kvodo. Because of the reason that Hashem's honor is everywhere. He says, listen, a person, and the reason why the Torah must have neglected to mention the words 4 amot by an arrogant posture, tell me what was his answer? To tell you when is it forbidden?
All the time.
All the time. Yeah. Not just more than 4 amot. All the time.
Because His glory fills the
Because
world.
Hashem's glory fills the whole world. Yeah?
What if you're walking with a straight back because you're short and everyone else is taller than you?
Oh, that's
it's more of a saying, I think, than
right. I'm not so sure that. I mean, our rabbis do mention that if your nose is in the air, but in any form that makes you come off as a haughty person, you're right.
Haughtiness, right?
Yeah, it's not so much. You should have a good posture, just not an arrogant posture. Yeah, that's a good question. So, Masha'enken, which is unlike bedin shel gilui rosh, in the halacha in the din of a revealed head. Shezeh mugdar keminhag chasidut, which this is a minhag of extra Piety or stringency. Ve'en raui lachmir bo, and it's not proper to be stringent about it. Bepachot mi-arba amot, in cases which are less than 4 amot.
It seems to be implying that haughtiness is more of a problem than the head covering, and that to separate one from the other doesn't make much sense.
Unless you're separating the two to show that haughtiness is stricter than not covering your head, which is what he's saying the Torah is doing.
But then what I was saying is that covering one's head does not make up for haughtiness.
Of course.
In fact, isn't the head covering simply to remind us of Hashem's constant presence so that we are not haughty?
Right. Well, that's not so simple. It's a big deal. We may even need bigger kippas that are heavier. But essentially, Shalom Aleichem. Can I make an announcement?
Sure.
The Ron gets a special Mazel Tov. He got accepted to Ner Yisrael Baltimore. Mazel Tov. So proud of you.
Where's your black hat?
Hi guys.
It's in the car.
Velvet t-shirt.
Black hat.
Yeah. No.
You guys just came from the airport or something?
Yeah, the airport. Yeah.
Straight in.
Wow, that's devotion.
I didn't tell them. One thing I didn't say.
I told my wife, alert, can't stop.
He got accessible day. It's a study day.
Itai, I have time to embarrass you.
wasn't so bad.
So, here's the thing. We now have to deal with the side of the coin. If the Gemara tells us, here you can come, we have extra papers. You just got back from yeshiva, right? So, now you can already do this all on your own. Come.
No, you can take the class.
That. Yeah. Vasovrim, those who are of the opinion, we have a problem. There are two camps now. The camp who holds that wearing a kippah is a stringency, it's an extra level of piety. Doesn't mean you're not allowed to do it, just that it's not necessary, it's not mandatory. And then you have the other camp. What does the other camp hold?
Mandatory.
It's mandatory. The camp that holds it's mandatory has a question to the camp that holds it's extra. How could it be extra if, tell me?
If you can't go more than 4 amot without it.
If?
If Hashem is everywhere.
I didn't hear you.
If Hashem is everywhere.
Okay, so that's not the question. It's a good question. It's not the question we're asking. If it says in the Talmud and it says in the Rambam and it says it's always talking about this head covering, how do you understand the stories in the Talmud, like the one by Rabbi Kiva? See that kid's not wearing a head covering? Must be he's a mamzer and a son of a nidah. How do you understand that piece of Talmud unless you're going to come out the conclusion that you must wear a head covering? So comes along here, Vasovrim, I can't say anything. Vasovrim, those who are of the opinion, she'eino elam midat chasidut, that the only reason we cover our head is for an extra level of piety. Mivi'im raya, they bring a proof to their position. Means there from the fact shenishtabchu, that they were praised. Rak hachachamim are on top of the next page. Rak hachachamim. See hachachamim on the top of the page? Here.
Oh.
Rak hachachamim. We have an extra.
I gave him the middle.
Okay. Rak hachachamim. Only the sages shenizharu that were careful mahalicha begilui rosh, from walking without a head covering on. Ki'im haya ze isul gamur, because if this is actually a prohibition, mahaributa bekach, what's so special that they're covering their hair? Meaning, the people who say it's only an extra level of piety, what's their proof? Tell me. We're praising these rabbis. Oh, look at them. They were so holy, they covered their head.
But it's an extra level of piety.
Why is it an extra level? How do you know that from the story?
Because
Because they wouldn't praise him otherwise.
They wouldn't praise him if it was
a normal
required.
behavior, right.
Oh, we're so proud of you. You're wearing pants today. Come on, you guys, kids older than 2 years old right now. You know to wear pants. Yeah, I mean, some people maybe not. And they tell the story about a yeshiva guy. He's standing under his chuppah with a suit and a tie, and tzitzit, and no pants on. And the rabbi says, "Excuse me, where are your pants?" He says, "Rabbi, I'm keeping a mitzvah." He says, "What mitzvah?" He said it said at the Brit, just like we brought him to the Brit, we should bring him to Torah, to the Chuppah, and to all kinds of good deeds. So I'm coming without pants, just like at my Brit Milah.
Remembered it? Oh, that is
The fact that you're praising,
What's the San Francisco story?
I never got this one.
you never heard it before. The fact that you're praising a rabbi for covering his head, what does that tell you about this idea of covering your head?
That's not the
It's not
normal.
required.
It's not required,
It's not
right? It's not
normative.
required. Amay nishtapchu, why praise them? Who writes this? I brought you a number of sources here. Kach ketvu, similar to this, wrote Bishut and the question and answers of the Maharshal, Rabbi Shlomo, guest the Lamed. He has a relative known as the Arizal. Rabbi Shlomo?
Luria.
Luria, very nice. Uva Darchei Moshe, who wrote the Darchei Moshe? Rabbi Moshe
Yisraelis.
Israelich, very nice. And the Bach, the Beit Chadash, Rabbi Yoel Sirkis. The Magen Avraham. The Birkei Yosef. The Birkei Yosef was written by Rabbi Chaim Yosef David Azulai, very nice. Uva Biur Hagra. Who's the Biur Hagra? Hagon, Rabbeinu, Eliyahu of Vilna, the Vilna Gaon. Baruka ve'od. I brought you a number of sources that seem to side with this logic. Of course it's not mandatory, because if it was mandatory, why would we praise the rabbis? So stop asking us questions about why is it that you hold it's optional if you see that the rabbis say you must do it. Because clearly we praise the rabbis who covered their head, meaning that it's not mandatory. But then we have the question the other way around. If this is true, we have a question back on these people. Okay, we're willing to give it to you. It's an extra level of piety. But we have a question to ask you. Here's our question. V'ladat hasovrim, according to you who hold she'eino ela memidat chasidut, this is only a extra level of piety. Lechora yesh lakshot, so you seemingly can ask a question. Madua Rabbi Akiva, why did Rabbi Akiva kava establish sha'yeled she'alach b'gilui rosh hu mamzer? The child who walked without a head covering is a mamzer. Ve'ech yitechen omar da'yeled mamzer, how can you say that a child is a mamzer? Machmat shelo kiyem davar, because he didn't keep something should be sudo, which at its basis, having midat chasidut is an extra level of piety. If you hold it's an extra level of piety, what's the question we have on you?
that why would we do something so serious?
Right, why would we say something so bad about the kid who didn't wear a head covering? And if you hold it's a requirement, what question do we have about you? Why would we praise the rabbis who cover their head? You hear both of these questions? Mm-hmm. So it's a double-edged sword. If you choose to side with one camp, you're in trouble. If you choose to side with the other camp, you're also in trouble. So what should you do? Don't make up a third option. You're going to have to decide between the two. Let's see it going.
All the mezuzot were crooked.
What?
Maybe it's different communities.
You're saying different communities with different societal norms. I would agree with you had it not been all in the same area of the Talmud. No, you're right. It seems to be that this is all from the same time period. So we're talking about a time in which either it was or wasn't. We don't have a clear-cut proof from either of these stories.
All the mezuzot
They seem to actually contradict each other.
crooked.
Either you praise them, right?
Yeah.
Either you praise them, or
You don't.
you don't because it's mandatory. So you have to make your choice. Umatzati, so I write here, I found Bibiur Hagra in the writings of the Vilna Gaon. The Vilna Gaon has a fascinating commentary on the Shulchan Aruch. Fascinating because you can't understand anything he says. Because he doesn't actually write anything, he just gives you sources. And from the sources you're supposed to figure out what he's trying to tell you. So, if I say that I found it in the explanation of the Vilna Gaon, it's because I found someone else who explained it this way in the writings of the Vilna Gaon, not because I'm brilliant enough to sit down and purport to understand what the Vilna Gaon says. Shekatav, the Vilna Gaon wrote, Liyashev, he wrote to try to answer the contradiction. Shachutzpah shel hayeled, this chutzpah of the child, Haita, that was Shegila Rosho, that he uncovered his head, Lifnei Hazkenim. His offense was not that he walked with an uncovered head, but rather he did that specifically. He took off his head covering in front of who?
Old people.
In front of the old people, the rabbis. Imagine if you were to walk by the rabbi of your shul. It's one thing if you don't wear a kippah. But it's one thing if you're wearing a kippah. When you see him, you go like that. Yeah. So what are you telling him? That's a chutzpahdik thing to do, right? Yeah. So it was funny for you to see it right now. This thing says the Vilna Gaon. It must be that he was wearing a head covering, and he was taking it off specifically in front of the rabbis. And Jack is laughing because we're reading so much into these stories. Yeah, we're like making up all the tapestry around them, but clearly we have to. You're going to have to come to some better answers than what we're going to give here, which is why we're weaving this entire story together. Like we found in the tractate of Kiddushin, Chalafahu Gavra Kameh, the certain man walked by him in front of a rabbi, Velo Michse Reisha, and he was not covering his head. Amar, he said, Kama Chatzif, how chutzpahdik is this person? People think chutzpah is a Yiddish word. Chatzif is the word chatzaf. It's an Aramaic word. Lachen, therefore, Ra'a Rabbi Akiva mechutzpato shloto nar, he saw that from the brazenness, the audacity, the chutzpah that was built into this kid's attitude, ki einenu mizera kasher, he didn't come from a kosher source. And he was right. Okay, so these two questions, we're asking them on each other. Let's leave them where they are right now. We didn't at all discuss yet the Kabbalistic side of covering your head. You know, whenever you come to a logical conclusion, it's, oh, see, so I can do this. And someone throws the Zohar at you. It says, no, you thought you can do it, but you really, really can't. I'll give you a classic example. How many of you wake up in the morning before a fast day and eat something? Yeah, right? A lot of people do that. I mean, the halakha says you can do that. The Zohar says no. When does the fast start? Once you go to bed. Once you go to bed, that's when the fast
you
starts.
have to have in mind that.
So the Kabbalists were going nuts. How can you guys eat? Okay, we know it's okay according to halakha, but aren't you afraid of the Zohar? So some people said, listen, we don't know much about the Zohar. That's why we're not flying on magic carpets, right? That's why we're eating right now. Maybe you should do it. Then the question is, who is the Zohar talking to? Is the Zohar talking to everybody? Or is the Zohar talking to people who are Zoharists, people who follow the Zohar, who live a life based on the Zohar? And the Ben Ish Chai seems to hold, no, you can't eat once you go to sleep, unless you make a condition that I'm eating when I wake up. Meaning, when I go to sleep again, that's my real going to sleep.
But he was a Zohar rectifier, right?
Sure, I mean the whole Ben Ish Chai lev was all Kabbalah. That Rav Ovadia Yosef, he writes, no, technically you're allowed to do it, but you shouldn't do it, because why mess with the Zohar? Yeah, so, it's interesting. They both came to a similar conclusion, but from two different angles. Let's see here what we find in the Zohar. Matzati, and I found the Hagaon Rabbi David Yosef, to the Rabbi David Yosef, that's actually here in this book. Hevi b'tshuvotav, he writes in his letters, Otzrot Yosef, the treasures of Yosef. Chedek Aleph, Siman Daled, in the first volume, Siman Daled, in the 4th chapter. I want to show you exactly what it is. You have your book in front of you? This book really has 2 books inside of it. You don't know that. It has 2 books inside. Around page 400, at 426 the book ends. At 426 the book ends. You're in the right direction. There, see? That's the end. And here starts a new book called Otzrot Yosef, the treasures of Yosef. Shelot v'tshuvot. These are questions and answers. Meaning Rabbi David Yosef gets asked a question, like on page Aleph, and he answers. So what I'm quoting right now is found in the 4th chapter of this section. In the second book, the first volume of this second book, in the 4th chapter. That's where I'm quoting from. So Rabbi David Yosef writes the following. Haviv b'tshuvotav Otzrot Yosef, he brings in his letters of Otzrot Yosef, et Lashon HaZohar HaKadosh, the language of the Holy Zohar, in Parshat Balak, which the Zohar says, Lo yelech adam daled amot b'gilui rosh. A person shall not walk 4 amot with a revealed head, mipnei hashchina, because of the divine providence, shilemala mirosho, because it is right above his head. The Zohar, does it seem to make any exceptions to this rule? Is it giving any differentiation between different kinds of people or for different kinds of things?
No, but it's looking at a world where it's like the difference between being in a room with a roof and windows and being out with the sun shining right on you.
Okay, I hear that. But the Zohar seems to say that a person must cover their head, at least from here. Ulam, but midivrei Hazar Kadosh, from the words of the Zohar Kadosh in Parshat Pinchas, in the Parsha Pinchas, mashma, it's apparent shezeh rak midat chasidut. It seems from the language over there that it's only an extra level of piety. V'rak letalmid chacham yesh isur badavar, and only a Torah scholar has a prohibition from not wearing a head covering. This is the Zohar seems to imply.
Conservative do.
A Torah scholar must wear a head covering, but simple people don't have to.
Conservative rabbi.
So maybe some don't. I don't know.
Rabbi keep it kosher, nobody else.
Someone asked me a question. They asked the rabbi a question, and the rabbi said you can do something, and the Shulchan Aruch says you can't. So why does he say it? I said, I don't know. When someone doesn't follow Shulchan Aruch, I don't really have an obligation to try to explain what it is that he's doing.
They all wear kippot, but they don't keep kosher.
Oh, that's even something else. So, v'chein muchach bazar, and it's also apparent from the Zohar in Parshat Naso. So, we find that the Zohar seems to say that a person must cover the head only if they are a Talmid Chacham, a Torah scholar. But if they're not a Torah scholar, can they cover their head? Yes. Do they have to? No. Okay, that's the conclusion of Rabbi David Yosef from the Zohar.
So, Rob, back to my question about why at schools they don't require tzitzit but a kippah. So why do they require anything at all? Like if a kippah isn't halacha and the tzitzit is too expensive.
So back to my answer is that I didn't make the school's policies. You should ask the person who did, but after your father sees you graduate. The reason I'd assume is because a kippah is more apparent as a uniform than tzitzit, because mostly people wear tzitzit underneath their clothing. And so it's probably, at least openly, you should be showing that you're wearing a kippah.
It's also an easier sell for a kippah, which is more familiar to Jews than
the
tzitzit.
tzitzit.
That seems to be much more of a, you're saying, oh, I'm really very religious.
Well, I'm not convinced you have to wear tzitzit.
Only if you have
Well, only
I don't know which school,
Well, we'll get there. We'll get there soon. But hello. I'm actually more of the persuasion that a kippah is more important than tzitzit. Even at this point in the discussion, where we're still proving that kippah is just an extra level of piety. But let's tell you the truth. Putting the Rambam aside, and the Tur aside, and the Bach aside, and the Gra aside, and the Magen Avram aside, and the Chida aside, and all these people, the Zohar, we're going to put it aside. At the end of the day, we want to know, what does Rabbi Yosef Karo feel about it? What's his understanding? He says you should not walk 4 amot without a head covering. But we already see that some people say should not walk is the same as you don't need to, only if you want to. Some say no, after 4 amot you have to wear a head covering. So what is Rabbi Yosef Karo's actual opinion? Who's right? Who's right when it comes to reading into them? So let's continue. V'gam katav levarer be'emet. He also came, who's he? Rabbi David Yosef, right? Rabbi David Yosef also came to clarify it shitat Maran Bet Yosef, the opinion of Maran, the Bet Yosef, b'inyan hazeh, in this topic. Maran Zal, Maran of blessed memory, bevet Yosef and his Bet Yosef, mevi divrei hakolbo. He brings a rabbi named the Kolbo, b'shem hamaharam, in the name of the Maharam, shezeh rak midat chasidut, that this is only an extra level of piety. So we find that Maran is already quoting a source that says that the idea of wearing a kippah is only an extra level of piety, midat chasidut. Ulam b'Beit Yosef, but in the Beit Yosef, nira shu notel divrei ha'osrim. It seems to be that he leans towards the words of those people who are actually prohibiting a person from walking without a kippah. V'chein mashma b'Beit Yosef, and also if you look in the 8th section of the Beit Yosef, top of the next page, of the next column, shasur min hadin mamash, that it's actually prohibited halachically. Ushmash masham, apparent from there, shaken dat ha'itur ve'hatur, that both the itur and the tur will both hold such a thing.
Who's the E2?
The itur is one of the Rishonim.
Oh, so there's a tour and an E2.
There's a itur and there's the tur. They're not the same people. So Maran seems to have two opinions. One who holds it's only optional, and one who holds that it's actually prohibited.
Divrei Yisurim, it's one of the
It's
forbidden
what
things.
prohibited? Wearing?
Walking without a kippah.
Walking without.
Meaning it's once it's optional, once it's mandatory. So Maran seems to write two different things. So here's the question. The question always is, what happens when Maran writes something in his Bet Yosef, but in his Shulchan Aruch he writes something else? Or you can infer something else from what he wrote in the Shulchan Aruch. Maran quotes two opinions in the Bet Yosef, and it seems to be he's leaning towards one. But in the Shulchan Aruch he says something else. Which book do we follow? Which book takes precedence over which book?
Shulchan Aruch is later.
Oh, very nice. The Shulchan Aruch was written after the Bet Yosef. Today you can just do an updated edition of your book and sell it again. And back in the days, you couldn't do such a thing. You sold your book. I mean, it ended up in Poland and Russia and Hungary and Morocco. People don't even know you put out a second edition. So the only way you can change what it is that you wrote is simply by the next book you write, you change your mind. You change your mind. In Chabad circles, they have a similar idea. They have a Shulchan Aruch that the first Lubavitch Rabbi wrote, which they don't follow. Especially not when it contradicts what it says in the Siddur of the first Lubavitch Rebbe. Sometimes they'll say something in Shulchan Aruch, and the Siddur will say something else. The reason being that he wrote his Siddur later, and therefore that was probably the conclusion he reached later on in his life, and that's the assumption. And therefore we have a halakha that says generally if you have two books, and the second book changes what was written in the first book, you follow the second book, because that was his later conclusion. So, says Chacham David Yosef, V'yesh lomar, you should probably say, Shehalacha k'mishnah achona, that the halakha follows the later edition, the later book. She'eino ela mimidat chasidut, that it's only optional, not mandatory. Where does he see this from? V'kach medayek milishon Shulchan Aruch, and this is what he infers from the language of the Shulchan Aruch. What does the Shulchan Aruch say? Maran zal nakat lashon asur. Maran only used the word asur, prohibited by what? By walking arrogantly, walking arrogantly. Yeah, with an arrogant posture. Aval, it said, Maran nakal lashon asur, beisur halicha b'kumas kufa, walking arrogantly. He said asur, you're not allowed to do it. But when it comes to not wearing a kippah, what word does Maran use?
Lo yelech.
Lo yelech. You shouldn't walk with your head uncovered. אבל אצל איסור הליכה בקומה זקופה, אבל אצל איסור הליכה בגילוי הראש, הוא נקט לשון לא ילך. כדי להראות, in order to show you שאינו אלא ממידת חסידות. Rabbi David Yosef's conclusion is that Maran actually holds that wearing a head covering is optional. But not walking arrogantly is mandatory. This is Chacham David's conclusion, at least in the opinion of Maran. He may have his own opinion, but in the words of Maran, because you always follow the later teaching, and if Maran wanted to say that walking without a head covering was forbidden, what would he have written?
Asur.
Asur. The fact that he chose to use the words lo yelech, you should not walk, what does that tell you about what he feels?
Optional.
It's
Optional. It's optional. Did you buy it?
Of course.
Why, of course?
Because there are two camps, right? One says that the one which says that this is Milat Hasidut, they explain Rabbi Akiva's point, right? But the other camp doesn't explain their point.
Oh, I thought nobody was going to pay attention. We left one question unanswered. Okay. So you answered good for Rabbi Akiva. Why it was that even though he holds it's optional, he still said this child is a mamzer. Because he did it in front of him. But according to the other camp, Why are you praising these rabbis for covering their head when it's not, if it's obligatory? If you have to do it, then why praise them? I didn't praise Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai for keeping Shabbat. Because he had to do it.
Maybe they did in a special way.
Oh, so we're going to get to such an answer. It's true.
Well, you were talking in your Devar Torah on Shabbat, on Rav Shimon Bar Yochai, that the Kabbalist lives in a different universe, so to speak, and that how they hold and how they view the world, how they view halacha, is from a different perspective.
Right. So if we were speaking here about Kabbalists, I would say that, you could say that the reason he did X, Y, and Z was he was a Kabbalist. But here we're dealing pretty much with halachic sources.
We just threw in the Zohar. Well, forgive me for saying threw in.
No.
Yeah.
No, you're right. We threw in the Zohar, but we kind of just, as an additional note, not to, if anything, the Zohar says that you don't have to wear it, only if you're a Torah scholar.
So, but it sets up that
opening, sure. So, Katavnu Le'el, we wrote above. If you guys feel it's too much, we'll hold it for the night, but I think we'll do a little bit more. Katavnu Le'el, we wrote above. Once you're already here, it takes a while to build up to that point. Katavnu Le'el, we wrote above. Sha'arambam mevit dinze. The Rambam brings down this halacha besugyatenu from our piece of Talmud about covering your head. Kihanhaga shel talmidei chachamim. As something that, remember the Rambam said, if you remember the first page, the Rambam says, Talmidei chachamim have an extra level of modesty, that they would walk with their heads covered. What do you see from that Rambam? It's obvious that he holds you only have to cover your head as a midat chasidut, and only if you are a talmid chacham, as a sign of modesty. Sure. Umikan sheino begeder isur klal, and you see from there that clearly the Rambam doesn't hold it's a prohibition, or else he would have said so. Omnam bad halechem mishneh. The lechem mishneh is a commentary on, guess which book? Mishneh Torah, on lechem mishneh, the bread of the Mishnah. It's a play on words. Kotev, he writes, she'en hasik kach behechrech. You can't come to this conclusion completely. I mean, it's not a solid. It's not like the Rambam said, only Torah scholars have to cover their hair. You're inferring something, but this inference is a little bit shaky for the following reason. Ve'efshar, it could be shebe'emet chal din ze al kol adam, that this law applies to everybody. Ben ish pashut or talmid chacham, whether a normal person or a talmid chacham. Ela sha'arambam, rather the Rambam ba lehadgish, the Rambam is coming to emphasize et chovatam shel talmidei chachamim lakpid behem biyoter. To emphasize that Torah scholars are so modest that they're especially careful about covering their head. Not that only Torah scholars have to cover their head, but the reason why the Rambam is mentioning this by tzniut, by modesty. I mean, as a sign of modesty, our rabbis always have their head covered. Okay, I hear that the Lechem Mishneh maybe is a little bit shaky.
What's Sugyatenu again?
Sugyatenu means our piece of Talmud, our sugya. What we're dealing with. That's the root word of that. What the Lechem Mishneh is doing is he's throwing in some doubt. Saying, don't get on this high horse that the Rambam says, oh, you don't have to wear a kippah unless you're a Torah scholar. Could be the Rambam was just saying something special about Torah scholars. So that by everybody else, he would also agree you have to wear a kippah.
Is the Mishnah Torah clear on this issue?
No. The Mishnah Torah only praises the rabbis for wearing kippahs, but doesn't say that everyone else doesn't have to. I mean, you can infer it, but the Lechem Mishnah, who's an authoritative commentary, and the Rambam doesn't seem to be convinced. He hears it, he's not convinced.
Who wrote the Lechem Mishnah?
Else about Torah
I don't know his name. I have to look up for you. What?
Does he say anything else about
Yeah, a lot of things. There's a whole list of things that Torah scholars do. It would be interesting. It would be interesting to go to that list and say, are all of these things halachot that we have to keep also?
Yeah.
That's a good point. Why don't we do it sometime? Go get that Rambam from this page and we'll look it up.
That'd be a great idea.
It's a good point. Maybe you'll write it down so we'll do it tomorrow.
Yeah.
Okay.
Homework. What's so special about Torah scholars? That's what we'll...
There you go.
Well, I don't know if I could have written something like this article when I was 17, let's put it that way.
That's pretty special.
I can't even understand it at 61.
Oh, thank you.
You're doing a good job of helping us understand.
Well,
It's not easy.
I'm working on it too. Okay, I'm quoting here a source that it's okay if I'm recording for this. Which I question sourcing today. Unfortunately, due to some events that have surrounded the situation, but we'll quote it as an opinion. Don't get bogged down by the name which we're quoting, just the idea that he's bringing to the table. Okay. I saw Sheharav Yonah Metzger, the Rabbi Yonah Metzger Shlita, Harav Rashi Israel, the chief rabbi, Ashkenazi rabbi of Israel, currently, not anymore. Then he was. Muchaber Sefer, and the author of the book Miyam Halacha, from the ocean of Halacha. Shoel B'Sifro, he asks in his book, Shelefi, that according to, this is coming to help Moshe Chaim out. Shelefi, that according to Otam Poskim, those authorities, Hasovrim, which are of the opinion, Shekayam Isur B'Halicha Lelo Kisur Rosh, that it's forbidden to walk around without a head covering completely. According to them, what was our question? What do we ask to them? If it's really forbidden, then
Why do we praise?
yeah, why do we praise the Talmidei Chachamim for doing so? That's a good question. We didn't get an answer yet. Shenishalu, when they were asked, Madua Tsuyanu, why were they praised? Hamoraim Bagmara, the Amoraim and the Gemara, Shishtabchu Bekach, that they were praised. Shalchu Bekisur Rosh, they wore a head covering. Lamot Shein Bekach Ributa, Shelo Asu Yisur. I mean, that's what they have to do. According to you, they have to do it, so why praise them that they're wearing a kippah? Hisbiru, he says there's an end, some explain, Shamoraim Nishtabchu, that the Amoraim were praised, Mishum, because Shemilvad HaKisui HaTachdon, Shan Rosham, that aside from the small kippah they wore underneath their, top of their head, Nitkasu Af Besudar or Betalit, they wore an extra scarf, or a kerchief, or a talit. Something additional on their head. He doesn't say hat, but he says they wrapped themselves up in something. Like a turban. The Gemara says such a thing about the Torah stuff. Before Shabbat, they would wrap their heads up in turbans. That's what the Gemara says.
There are pictures of the Rambam. He always has one of those.
With a strammel.
I have kids' books in some of the cheders in Borough where Moshe Rabbeinu and Aaron have shtreimels on them.
I told my brother-in-law.
I had an argument there. He said Moshe Rabbeinu had a bekisher. I said they didn't have bekishers back then or fur.
I told my brother-in-law that one of them that he's going to have a problem. I said, "Do you pray without a shtreimel?" And he said, "No." So what are you going to do when Mashiach comes? So what do you mean? We're not going to change anything. We're going to become more religious. I said, "Okay." I said, "But they're not going to let you into the Beit HaMikdash with a dead animal on your head. That's against the laws of purity. So what are you going to do?"
AstroTurf.
No, I know what they're going to do. They're going to make another minion outside because they don't hold the Mashiach. So,
It'll be a living.
not him. He's a holy person. But
Won't be able to kill animals anymore.
he's allowed to
It'll
ship.
be a living mink.
Jerome just read the magazine that Sony patented a new
Smart.
smart
I got this
shade
man
tool.
magazine.
Smart shade tool with like chips inside and like
It knows how to cover itself up.
Like if you get lost, like for like older people, get lost like a GPS.
Oh, it's
where
like
you go.
like Google Glasses.
And it'll send vibrations.
The headline was so if you're
I think the Tommy's going to like style itself. It'll take it to the Sheitel Macher.
You don't know where the husband is.
It
all
knows
the
how to
time.
burn itself. Things like that.
This man magazine.
Get out of the bar. Come home.
It's in this man magazine, you know.
No.
This man.
So
what's your alibi?
he writes. So Rav Yonah Metzger writes that they wore an extra head covering. Shehimidat Chasidut Yara is an extra level of piety. So he answers our question by saying, "You're right. Everyone had to wear a head covering, but Torah scholars wore an extra head covering." U'mekivan shezohi mitzvah lechol adam, and because it's a mitzvah for every person lalechet b'kisui rosh to wear a head covering, lechen amrutz, because of that they say shehaholech b'gilui rosh, that someone who walks with the head uncovered lifnei chachamim muskenim, before the rabbis and the elders, zo chutzpah, that's chutzpah. Says, you may think you caught me because you asked a good question, but we have a better answer to the other question. We have a better answer to the other question. What, you're going to tell me he threw it off in front of the rabbis? Come on. It doesn't say that in the story, right? It says he was walking without a head covering, completely. And he was supposed to have his head covered. And now what you asked me why the rabbis were praised, that they wear head coverings, because they wore an extra head covering. They wore an extra head covering. Which is something you still see rabbis do today. I mean, it's not so far-fetched. It's not so far-fetched to see such a thing. happen around.
Siman rabbis were
Rav Shlomo Aviner, who was the chief rabbi of Bet El of Yeshivat Ateret Yerushalayim in the Muslim quarter, he writes that his Rebbe, Rav Tzvi Huda Kook, who was the son of Rav Kook, he said that he wishes that his students would all wear hats. Because it was a sign of rabbinic leadership that existed then. And so they asked Rabbi Ner, so why don't you wear a hat? He said, I'm not as holy as my rabbi wanted me to be. Something along those lines. Like, he didn't get there yet. But you find that it's not just the Haredi community that wears hats, but very often in rabbinic community,
Yes.
you know, like I wear my hat very rarely on Shabbat, and whenever I'm at a rabbinic meeting or something, I have to look like a rabbi, so I wear a hat. But in my own life, I can't handle wearing a hat. But in general,
It's not that bad.
and if you got me like a fez or something, I'd think about it. But a hat, it's not aerodynamic. I have to keep holding on to it. Isn't it? So there's the idea that Talmidei Chachamim, they wear a hat or a scarf or a talit or something else. And this comes, by the way, to tell you about the custom why people don't cover their head with a talit unless they're a Torah scholar, or in Ashkenazi communities when they're married. The reason for being married is because that's already a sign of taking on more responsibility halachically, of being a little bit extra pious than what you did when you had your bar mitzvah. Because in Europe, children of bar mitzvah wore talitot. In Germany, the Germans just wore talitot. Only by their wedding did they cover their head.
Yeah.
A Torah scholar in Morocco covered his head. And those are things that only Torah scholars did. So therefore, everyone had a kippah, but they had an extra covering they wore when they prayed. Yeah, I want to hear, what do you think about this answer?
Makes sense.
Makes sense.
It doesn't satisfy.
It wasn't in the story also.
It doesn't satisfy.
Well, we'd have to look at more sources to give some ground to this, to see.
It's a nice idea, but we have to see it backed up somewhere maybe a little
We
bit.
haven't
If you
looked
wear
at any
extra,
sources.
Then you're a rabbi.
Oh, no, that doesn't mean the other way around, that if you wear that, you're a rabbi. You were saying?
It doesn't criticize people who walk bareheaded. Does not mean walking with just one kippah.
Oh, Jack has to go. I was waiting for someone to ask this question. He says, my whole life, I walked around, I never walked bareheaded. Bareheaded? You can't tell me that this is bareheaded.
Yeah.
That's not the definition of bareheaded. I mean, it's a nice answer, but you didn't really answer the question, because it's a nice answer if you hold it's obligatory, so why do you praise the rabbis for wearing a head covering? But it's not what the rabbis are praised for. The rabbis are praised for never having their head uncovered, which is very different than having your head covered. It's a very good point.
But again, we lack sources, and also, are these minhagim, or are we looking at halachot when we look at this? You know, we still have a jungle, a thicket to separate out into its proper components.
Sure.
It's just adding another aspect into the mix.
So let's do one more piece for tonight. One tiny piece. Let's hop to the next page. We'll call it a night.
Kufman?
Kufman. Tomorrow we'll be dealing with Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, again with Rabbi David Yosef, also with
Add more Hazuk.
the first Lubavitcher Rebbe. We'll be seeing what he writes in his books tomorrow. So let's see what the Maharshal says. Rabbi Shlomo Luria. The Maharshal was a distant cousin of the Arizal. He was still in Europe, from what I understand. HaMaharshal, in his letters, Kotev, he writes, Sha'afna poskim dilel, even to the above-mentioned poskim, Asher sovrim, that they hold shekisui harosh, that head covering eino ela midat chasidut is only optional. He's going to say something radical here. You're not going to like it anymore. Katvu, that they write, she'en lehakel bekach, you should not be lenient in this matter. Ho'il, because v'ha'am, the nation of Israel, nahagu b'zeh isur. The Jewish people have a custom to forbid walking around bareheaded. Friends, I want you to stop for a second. This is the first time we've mentioned a minhag. I want you to see what a minhag does to the halachic process. Logic was going great. Sources were going wonderful. And all of a sudden we take this wrench called the minhag and we throw it in between the wheels. Yeah, even according to you who hold it's okay, but the minhag is not like that. And now you see why we get so frustrated at minhagim. people whose whole basis of Judaism is minhag, so they love throwing the wrench. But those whose whole basis of Judaism is halakha, they hate to be the ones to catch it.
It's hot.
Yeah. But because the people
It hurts. Yeah.
have the custom to prohibit, you see Jewish communities everywhere, people wear kippahs. Ki yesh hadanim, there are those who would consider it ha'over al isur zeh, someone, thank you very much, it's getting mitzvot. Someone who violates this, bepritzut, with promiscuity, v'kalut rosh, and lightheadedness, v'over al dat Yehudit, and violating Jewish standards.
Yeah, this sounds very familiar. I have to say. We hear this a lot
Minhag
today.
is different between communities.
But this is a wrench that a lot of communities use to keep people in line.
Well, I'll tell you like this. It's okay, you don't have to wear a kippah, but don't expect us, when you come to shul, for us to count you as a minion. Because we're not sure you're religious. How are we supposed to know? Everyone else is religious, wears a kippah. It's not a wrong suggestion. Meaning you have an obligation, it says in the Torah, Veitim Nikim, you have to be clean, Hashem, with Hashem, Israel, and also from the Jewish people. You have an obligation at some point to take into consideration the Jewish people's standards. I don't agree that you have to be a slave to the Jewish people's standards, but to be aware that if you do something that's not the Jewish norm, whatever that is, and whatever community is going to have a different norm, then you will be essentially saying something. You're making a statement whether you like it or not. The fact of the matter is, when we see a Jew without a kippah on his head, we don't automatically assume that he's observant. When you see a Jew with a kippah on his head, eating pork chops, so it's a stira, like it knocks you out. You're not sure what to do with that image. Yeah? So we seem to attach a lot of significance to the kippah. So even those who say that you don't have to wear a kippah, it's only an extra level of piety, they themselves will tell you that it's a good idea to do so today, because if you don't do it, it's going to be making a statement, and you don't want to make that statement. What's becoming a little bit more clarified now? What did Rabbi David Yosef in the book tell us the reason for wearing a kippah was?
To differentiate.
To differentiate yourself from people who don't live a life of Torah and mitzvot. Where does he get that from? We're starting to see the roots of this. The idea that you want to look a certain way because it represents something.
You have to be careful with that.
Yeah, very careful with that.
Because it obscures so much, and people are so much into kitzoniyut in this world.
But this is something that has halachic sources. Some of the opinions are of the opinion that it's mandatory. Even those who hold that it's not mandatory, push comes to shove, will tell you that it's still a good thing to do. It's not a bad thing to do. This is very different than saying if you don't wear a long black coat, then you're not Jewish.
Understood.
And this is because it has you're right. We have to be careful with what we make people do because of societal norms.
As you so often point out, many people who have the garb do Chilul Hashem on a regular basis.
Right. I suggest you look up an article I don't entirely agree with, but it was a refreshing perspective. By Rabbi Dr. Yonatan Lopez Cardoza.
Oh, yes.
You know who he is?
Article. I think I've been sent
So you may have been the one to send it to me. I don't remember.
Great
Could be.
article.
Zev sent me a lot of good stuff. Something about I want to take off my kippah. I don't remember the name of the article. Which he basically sets down his idea that maybe he should stop wearing a kippah for a little bit. He was thinking about it. And his struggle with what a kippah means and why it means so much, and the duality of people who wear the kippah and don't act like a person who does wear a kippah, and so on and so forth. Just an interesting perspective, maybe to balance out the article that Jack's going to be sending us. Our Google groups are starting to get up and running, by the way. If you got an invitation, please accept it, because we're getting people into our group, and then we'll be able to send out reading material to supplement what it is that we're learning here. But to Rav Aviner writes, Rav Aviner says that a person has to wear a big kippah, wear a kippah, but a big kippah, one that covers almost all your head.
Not the ones they sell in the Kollel, which are like 1 inch.
No, Rav Aviner, I mean it very seriously. Rav Aviner wears the kippah.
Like the red strings.
Yeah, it's
Like the one you
Rav
said about
Aviner's
the red
kippah
strings.
is about.
I got this in Midtown, L.A. The Rabbi Michelin said that it's like a soup bowl.
Oh, so put it on your head for a second.
Use it first.
I want to use his kippah as an example. Put it for 1 second. We'll put it on. Rav Aviner's kippah goes down to where your ears are. Yeah, it covers his entire head.
It's a thinking
That's
cap.
his thing. Okay, so we'll have to balance out these opinions with other opinions. And tomorrow, the first thing we're going to be dealing with is Rav Moshe Feinstein. Rav Moshe Feinstein. Rav Moshe Feinstein is very significant in this discussion because of his place in defining Orthodox halachic norm in this country. And he was the first person people were asking, do I wear a kippah, do I not wear a kippah? If I'm not going to get a job, if I will get a job, who has to wear a kippah? Rav Moshe Feinstein was a very, I know it sounds funny to say, but a very honest posek. Rav Moshe Feinstein was not known for avoiding problems or beating around the bush or making people be extra stringent when he didn't have a choice. He tried very much to be honest. You ask me a halachic question, I'm going to answer you in halachic fashion. And he'll then say, but Jewish norm will be something else. But he'll tell you the answer. And we're going to be very enlightened when we read a little bit of what Rav Moshe says tomorrow. So, B'ezrat Hashem, we'll stop for tonight. And I'll see everybody tomorrow.